Good morning, everyone. It is 10 a.m., December 28th. I'm Zafar Sobhan, coming to you live from Dhaka, Bangladesh. John, I think it is still the 27th night, if I'm not wrong. Tell me, what time is it for you?
Well, it's the holidays, so you lose all sense of day and time. So I know Christmas has happened, New Year's hasn't happened yet. We're somewhere in between those two dates.
Okay, and that's as close as you can get it. And I recognize the landmark behind you. I mean, this is it's Mount. Well, is it Mount Rushmore?
It is, and as I once I put the graphic up and I looked at it, I realized that some people would think I'm putting myself on Mount Rushmore.
Right.
That was not the
Okay.
intent, and my head is not hiding President Trump. He has not yet been added to Mount Rushmore. But
Okay.
if I move my head, you'll see Teddy Roosevelt, who's probably the person that most non-Americans wouldn't expect to see on Mount Rushmore. And we can
Sure.
get into it later, but while Teddy Roosevelt, like any political leader, is not perfect, one thing that I really like from President Roosevelt was his famous speech about the man in the arena. And that has some resonance for me today as we'll talk about some of the political events. So, so I'm joining you virtually from South Dakota from Mount Rushmore.
Okay. Good. Good. Super. Well, let's get to it. These have been a couple of big days in Bangladesh. We have seen first on Christmas Day the arrival of Tariq Rahman in Bangladesh after being in exile 17 years, perhaps 18 years. I'm not sure of the exact date he left. Then, of course, we have the political alliance between NCP and Jamaat, which has been announced, and the fallout thereof. So, what would you like to start with, John?
It's easy to be a critic, and I've been critical of many things in the past, including Tariq Rahman's failure to return to Bangladesh up to this point. But I think it is time to share some bouquets, and those are for all of those involved in managing Tariq Rahman's return, and certainly to him as well. From my perspective, everything has gone just about as well as could have been hoped for, from the optics and the atmospherics, again, particularly as they played from outside, to what he's done and said. I mean, I think he has found his voice, and the tone that he has struck has been consistent throughout. And it's something that I can see people grasping onto. I mean, obviously, the diehard BNP supporters, we're always going to welcome him, we're always going to support him. But I think, his challenge is to reach out to skeptics. There's a big pool of people out there who haven't voted before or may have voted for a party that's not going to be participating. So that's really where the election will be won and lost. So, so far, so good. And now the question is, can he keep it up over the next, 2 months or so?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a successful homecoming. There's no question about that. Interesting thing from the perspective of someone who lives in Dhaka is that, and I'm not actually sure how many people did show up. We've seen many, figures
Yeah.
thrown around, and I mean, it's hard to say who's counting, and especially when it's a disparate crowd, on sort of streets from one part of the city to the next. Is very hard to count. But one thing which impressed me was that they did not disturb or disrupt traffic. I mean, or to the extent that it was done, it was very, very minimal. We in Dhaka were fearing much, much worse. Many people canceled events, they canceled plans, and decided they would stay home. In the event, it turned out that it was fairly orderly, which is, again, this is actually something which is very new in Bangladesh, because I think part of the political culture is that the way to show strength, the way to show support, is in fact to disrupt and disturb the general populace as much as possible, and that is considered success. So to the extent that the BNP clearly didn't decide to measure success by how much they could bring the city to a standstill and how much they could inconvenience the rest of us, that to me was a breath of fresh air right there.
Yeah. And, it's interesting too. Again, on the optics side, several people had talked about or mentioned, the famous bus that they were procuring a bus for Tariq Rahman, that he would be on a bus trip. And I didn't quite get it. But,
Yeah.
it certainly had that image of kind of like the whistle stop, trains that used to carry candidates
Right.
around in the past. And I think it was effective. And, again, I can see him, taking his bus on tour around the country. People are the other thing I like is that his team, at least, is very sensitive to public opinion. So for me, one thing that struck was there was some criticism after the big rally at the 300-foot road that his
Oh yeah,
followers
the
had left
littering.
behind a
Yeah,
mess. And then, and immediately there was a response from BNP, from spokesperson, that the party workers had been ordered out onto the streets. Now, it seems that it turned out that actually it was the Dhaka municipality, char force that was doing the cleaning, but at least symbolically, some BNP workers were out there.
yeah.
And then again, back to
The
your
fact
favorite
that they
subject.
cared enough. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And then back to your favorite subject, I think Tarique, or I guess his daughter's cat, had also a triumphant return or arrival in Bangladesh. That was also, I think, very well managed.
Yeah. No, and like I said, is a well known and long time catophile. It's been great. Now I love the fact that they've really leaned into it because it kind of
Mhm.
became a little bit of a social media sensation, Zebunessa the cat, without really anyone thinking about it. But again, what we see here is we see a savvy social media team who really kind of understood what was happening organically and said, okay, how can we build on this? Let's see if we can work this to our advantage. I think much remains now to be seen what's going to happen. We have about a month and a half before the elections on February 12th. So I don't know. My guess is presumably, as you said, there'll be sort of a whistle stop tour kind of thing. There are 64 districts in Bangladesh. He's not going to be able to hit them all, but presumably, one presumes he's going to try and hit as many of them as he possibly can. And this is going to be around what the BNP builds its election campaign. And I think for Tariq, I think he did well so far. It's reasonably, you know, the great thing he has going for him is that the bar is so low. We're looking for just basic competence. We're looking for basic um, likability. And
Mhm.
if he's able to demonstrate those, which I think he has done so far, then that is really all that a lot of people are going to be hoping for.
Right. And, I think BNP's communications team did a good job of getting their surrogates out there. I saw
Yeah.
many interviews, I saw a lot of things in print. So certainly, again, amplifying his message, the team was out in full force. Again, I'm not sure that, his handlers will welcome me pointing this out, but I was also struck by the positive reaction to his arrival and return, and his words from across the border. I mean, there was some good international coverage as well, but in a Indian media landscape that finds very little positive to comment about in Bangladesh, there were a lot of positive comments about Tariq Rahman, and again, for all of the criticisms that he had faced in the past, and the previous BNP government had faced, it seems pretty clear that the Indian media and establishment has latched on to Tariq as their best hope, at least in the short term.
No, the interesting thing about Tariq is that for the last 15 years it's fascinating to see this evolution. He has been a millstone, or had been a millstone, around the BNP's neck, and this is something which I've been part of so many discussions on television shows, at roundtables, where the hope was that why can the BNP not rid itself of Tariq Rahman? He's dead weight. He's remaindered goods, and why can't a new BNP be born out of the people on the ground? We had all of these discussions, and the notion that he was unacceptable to India, that he was unacceptable in the United States, that he was unacceptable to the international community. And the interesting thing is, in the last 18 months, that negative, that stigma which is associated with him, has completely vanished. That is no longer the case. It's no longer that he is any kind of a a negative or any kind of a millstone for the BNP. To the contrary, he is now probably right now the greatest single asset the party has. As they enter this election season, because he's very recognizable. He's a face of the future. He is someone who people can see as a potential future prime minister. And in Bangladesh, this is important because quasi presidential
Mhm.
system prime minister has an awful lot of power and visibility. And it's not so much, yes, it is 300 different races for 300 different seats, but the person who is going to be the face of the party and the leader of the party in our is enormously important in our elections. As I said, sort of quasi-presidential in a sense. So that is a stunning transformation, I feel, which is very different. And of course, we've seen it evolve over the last 18 months or so, and it's had some ups and downs. I think, it took a knock earlier in the month when he wasn't coming, but again, the interesting thing is how quickly the news cycle moves. There was a lot of negative press, and then all of a sudden that's kind of forgotten, and it's now we're back to the positive again.
Right. And, again, none of the other parties, that are contesting really have, an equivalent. And certainly, a force multiplier for Tarique is his family as well, which again,
Yeah.
I think his wife, his daughter have also been, embraced by the people. And again, for the other parties and their leaders, you don't have that same phenomenon. I think the other really smart thing that Tarique and his team did was find a way for him to embrace and identify with the July Revolution, and again, I think, the recent assassination of, Sharif Osman Hadi, in a sense, presented an opportunity for Tarique because it gave him, again, an opportunity to embrace, Hadi and his legacy as kind of a stand-in for the broader, July movement. So again, I would have thought that would have been a vulnerability for him, his having been outside the country and missed the July Revolution. And you could have seen him run away from that or turn hostile against it. But I think he's wisely made the decision that, he needs to embrace that and embrace the younger generation. Again, time will tell as the campaign goes on. The other thought I had today as I was thinking about this is it must be driving Sheikh Hasina and her family crazy because obviously there's a lot of bad blood between those two families. But then again, if Sheikh Hasina looks in another direction, she has Mohammed Yunus. If she looks in another direction, she has the student leaders. And in another direction, she has the Jamaat Islami. So wherever she looks, there's not anyone there that she could see as her favorite candidate. I mean, she only sees her favorite candidate if she looks in the mirror.
Well, it's interesting that, I think you are correct when you say that he's done a good job of, and it was very smart politics to go and try and embrace Usman Hadi, his message, and the politics of the July uprising. I think one thing which is interesting to me, and I'm not sure this is more sort of backroom chatter rather than anything that has been confirmed, is that he had wanted, or he had thought about actually going to Tungipara as well. And I think he's been dissuaded. I think there's a security concern there. He's been dissuaded from doing that prior to the elections, but perhaps he will go after the elections. And I think that is actually very interesting because on the one hand, reaching out and trying to co-opt or trying to, the message of the July uprising is, I think that's fairly smart, but obvious politics. Whereas how he deals with, Awami League voters, how he deals with, the sort of the soft Awami League voters who are up for perhaps looking elsewhere for the vote is very interesting. And I think, again, if we're talking about unifying the country, if we're talking about someone who can bring the disparate strains of this country together, that is, I don't know what we'd say, 10, 15, 20% of the people who are going to have to be reached out to at some point. Perhaps after the election would be the time. But it's interesting. And I think, in fact, if you also see his record, through the years, and even back when he was in the country, he's actually always been someone to, speak well of his rivals. He's not one of the people who's out there, sort of throwing, a lot of Bangladeshi politicians have a very sort of zero-sum game approach, and so he's not one of those. So these are all good signs, I think.
Yeah, and I think the other challenge, obviously, for any political leader, and I think particularly for him, is how he divides his time going forward. So certainly he's going to be the main face of the campaign, even though it's not a presidential system and each candidate has to run their own campaign. Obviously, there's that overall kind of party image. and the kind of coattails effect that they'll want to see. At the same time, he's got real family issues to deal with, including, his mother, who is seriously ill. He's been away from home, so he has to tend to family. And then I think there's also the preparation he'll have to do if he, is elected and has to govern, both within his own party, kind of assessing people up close, seeing them in the environment, making decisions about who he might select for cabinet positions. So in a sense, all of the BNP leaders are auditioning for future roles. And at the
Sure.
same time, he'll have to develop those relationships with others, whether it be the private sector, the international community, civil society, his political rivals, who again may end up being, with them in parliament, playing perhaps a role of an opposition. So he's got a full schedule, and I hope that those who are tending to his, image are also thinking about, how you manage his time, which is for any politician or any leader, their most valuable asset is their day and their time.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting. I mean, it seems, at least so far, that he has been handled very well. And I think there are two key takeaways here. One is clearly his team of advisors is very skilled and they're
Mhm.
advising him well. So, I mean, I think in that sense, he's in good hands. And I think in these days, all politicians need a team like that around them. There's no such thing really as as a sort of the singular politician, which we may have had in days gone by. And secondarily, though, I think is equally important is the fact that he listens. It
Mhm.
appears, at least, that he listens. He listens to good counsel, he listens to good guidance, and that, of course, is absolutely huge.
Mhm.
So again, as we say, it's early days. I mean, it's perhaps a little premature for either of us to speculate further. We'll see what we'll see what the next month and a half brings. But certainly, again, sitting here in Bangladesh, I think most people I speak with, if you sort of put your finger in them, and most people are happy to see him back. They feel that this is a good thing,
Mhm.
and they're looking forward to the next month and a half. It's very interesting, actually. Let's talk a little bit about what's happening on the other side of the political aisle. What do you make of the coalition between the NCP and the Jamaat?
Yeah, so it's obviously been a fast moving story, and I've seen a lot of social media and other media speculation and information coming out. And my first thought is with the NCP leaders, including those who have decided to now contest as independents, which I know at least one has, and presumably others may do so
Yeah.
as well. I have the utmost respect for all that they've done over the past 18 months. I salute them for their contributions, for their commitment. And I respect their decisions either way. I respect those who stay in the NCP, and I
Hmm.
respect those who decide to go in a different way. So I'm not choosing sides by any means. And then, obviously people are looking at this from their own political perspective, and you can see and take comments from people aligned with another party, with a grain of salt. What I would say though is that the idea of forming election coalitions or alliances is nothing new in Bangladesh. This happens all the time. It's already happening this election cycle, and in the first past the post system, particularly when parties have disparate pockets of strength, it makes a lot of sense to do it. So I can understand why a party would do that. And to me, the alternative to having that kind of pre-election alliance building would be to take the extreme view, which has been discussed and I think rejected by the mainstream, of going to some kind of proportional representation system. Um,
Mm.
so, you'll have to have some kind of negotiation, some kind of alliances in a multi party system, either before or after elections. So, I can understand why an alliance would form. I can understand, the critiques. Although, what the final thing I would say on this, and again, I'm interested in your views. Ideological consistency to me has never been a main consideration when it comes to forming alliances. There have
Mm.
been alliances of very strange bedfellows in Bangladeshi politics, and that's because they serve a certain purpose. And in fact, in some ways, the heterogeneity of the alliances is the point. That if a party believes that it needs to appeal to a constituency outside its core, it may seek to do that by attracting somebody to their alliance that represents another viewpoint. which again is something that if you're being brought into a bigger alliance, you have to be conscious of the fact that the reason somebody may want you is not because of your sparkling wit or your good looks, but maybe it's because you bring something that they want.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested to see how it pans out in the final analysis, whether in fact this alliance is going to work to the benefit of the NCP. It seems to me from the polling that I have seen that NCP voters and Jamaat voters are actually quite different in whether, joining together in an alliance is going to be, in the end, helpful for NCP, I think is unclear. We'll only know when the votes are finally counted. I've heard very eloquent defenses of the alliance. My friend Sultan Muhammad Zakaria wrote a very long piece on Facebook where I thought he did a very good job of laying out what they hope to accomplish. I'm not sure I found it entirely persuasive, but as you say, there are good arguments on both sides. And I also understand many people who feel that that it's something of a betrayal, and that they think that it reveals the NCP to be, what they had always assumed the NCP to be, which would be a center-right party, and their worst fears about the students and the student leaders have been realized through this alliance. I'm not sure. I think, speaking to your point, that that's necessarily a fair and judicious assessment of what actually the alliance means. I mean, politics makes for all kinds of bedfellows, and you could also make the argument that well, yes, they may have an impact on us, but hopefully we can have an impact on them. I think what it does is it kind of crystallizes the issues. We now know who we're going to get in what constituency, who's going to go up against who, and that's going to be interesting to see. My sense is that ultimately will not actually advantage either Jamaat or NCP to the extent that the party leaderships have hoped.
Yeah. So, I've thought about this, a lot when it comes to NCP, a new entrant into the political arena. Certainly a lot of passion and, a certain amount of momentum after the July Revolution, which then, runs up against the cold, hard realities of, running political campaigns in a place like Bangladesh. Again, I give credit to those candidates who want to play by the rules, including the limits on expenditures. But we both know that those, regulations are often just disregarded by candidates. So I doubt that many other candidates are going to limit themselves in terms of the resources. So I always thought it was unrealistic that the NCP would be able to field 300 candidates in this election. And if you're running independently as a party and you're not able to field candidates in all the constituencies, there may be questions of why you're not doing that. So it could be a sign of weakness. So in some ways, a negotiated seat sharing arrangement simplifies NCP's problems in that it allows them to then concentrate on a smaller number of candidates to pick their best, whatever the number is, 30, 40, 50 candidates, and decide, where they can be most effective. And again, if the alliance comes with some resources to assist those candidates, then, perhaps all the better. The real issue will come down to how effectively the leadership of the parties is able to influence the votes of their followers. So if in fact, there's a seat sharing arrangement, the NCP puts forward its candidates in the agreed upon constituencies, can the Jamaat or other members of the alliance really convince and compel their voters to support that candidate,
Right.
regardless of what the ideology is? And I'm also reminded that for many years the Awami League's main political goal was to break the BNP Jamaat alliance, because their math was very simple, that they saw themselves as the largest or having the largest support base in the country, and in a first past the post system that would yield victory for them if they could split their opposition. And the thing that
Yeah.
they feared the most were the other two major parties teaming up against them and then being able to overcome that advantage. So I can understand from a BNP supporter perspective why you would want to do everything you could to try to diminish the chances of an alliance against you. And I can understand that if you are at least perceived as, the second and third, entrance, that it would make sense for you to tactically move together. The one part of this, which I don't know, and again, we may learn more about this in the coming days, is whether uh, the other parties are able to form an electoral alliance without a commitment or an understanding that that means that necessarily they'll cooperate together after the election. And if the NCP is able to gain a certain number of seats in parliament, perhaps more than they would have on their own, but that they're not bound to sit with the Jamaat in the parliament and act in concert, but can have an independent third kind of grouping within parliament. Maybe they get to be a little bit of a swing vote. So that might be an argument
That's certainly
politically.
how they have pitched it to their skeptical sort of supporters and onlookers and observers in precisely that way, that this will allow them to punch above their weight. They are in no way obligated to then support Jamaat positions in parliament. They will take their own positions. So that remains to be seen. You mentioned to what extent Jamaat can convince their voters to vote for NCP candidates. And of course, it's also to what extent they can convince their party workers to work for these candidates, because I think there are two elements of every election. The first is the electioneering, and then the second is the voting. So both of these things, and of course, the same thing exists for the BNP in a smaller scale. They have many coalition partners too, and it's an open question, really, that whether the local BNP workers and the local BNP leaders, who have been, some of whom may have had an ambition to run in that seat themselves, will then subordinate themselves for the good of the party. They will take the dictate from the high command, and then they'll work their hearts out for this candidate who's not even theirs. Oftentimes, what's happened, even in we've seen this in the past with the Awami League, is that it doesn't matter what dictate comes from the high command. The local leader, the local level leaders and workers have very little incentive, really, to give up their seats, their power to some, it might be in the interest of the BNP as a whole to make some seats available to their alliance partners. It may be in the interest for the Jamaat-e-Islami as a whole to make some seats available to NCP or the other partners they may have. But for the actual people who are expected to give up those seats and give up their shot at those seats and give up their power, it makes no sense at all. So that's always a tension we see in these kinds of arrangements, which often do not go according to plan, simply because on the ground the reality is very different. And as you say, of course, the voters. It's you can't in the final analysis convince. It's very, very difficult to convince your voter that, okay, don't vote for us, vote for this other person, especially if there isn't at least some base level of ideological affinity. Okay,
Sure.
you
And
can't just you can't
yeah,
just sort of say, well, vote for this person and expect it to happen.
right. And we, at least I don't know for certain, but I certainly have been led to believe that negotiations certainly took place between the BNP and the NCP over a possible alliance as well. So we talk about sports now and then. We all like when a player who's a free agent joins our team, and the team that doesn't get them, may have some sour grapes. So this might be the case where the BNP was simply outbid or out negotiated by the Jamaat in terms of, the NCP, or, the NCP may have had other considerations. There may still be some members of the NCP, some leaders who will go independent. Some may end up coming with the BNP or a BNP alliance as
Time
well.
down the line, sure.
Right. The other factor which I've seen, which is an interesting one, is that the NCP also may be gaining potentially on the number of seats in the lower house, but I've seen an argument that actually this might hurt the NCP's chances in the upper house. Again, if that's those seats are determined by proportional representation, and if that kind of process goes forward, there may have been an argument that by running more candidates in more constituencies, you raise your overall share of the national vote, which yields
Right.
more seats in an upper house. But by limiting yourself to whatever your share of the pie is in an alliance, you're forfeiting those seats in the upper house. So again, I don't know if that's an issue for discussion between the parties in the alliance, but that could come into play as well. So again, this is these are tough decisions. I appreciate the degree to which people are taking this seriously, that there's open debate, and I know that there are some sore feelings about this, and that's, again, it's understandable, and I think what one would expect.
Now, I'm simply glad that we are having these discussions. I'm glad that we seem to be moving towards some kind of a conclusion on all of these issues. And I think at the end of the day, you put this all before the voters and let the voters have their say. That's what elections are all about. You and I can comment, we can observe, other people will have their own takeaways from these. But at the end of the day, what really matters is what the voters think. And, the truth of the matter is, in Bangladesh, we haven't had a real election for many, many years. So we actually have, all of us, we make our livings, punditing and prognosticating. But the truth of the matter is, we really don't know. And we can give it our best guess, and maybe our best guess may be a reasonably educated guess. But until those votes are in and until those votes are counted, I don't think anyone really knows what Bangladesh is going to look like and what Bangladesh actually does look like right now, which is why this election is so important, apart from all of the other reasons that elections are important to bring us a government, to give us some stability, to move us to a democratic future. I think it is going to be incredibly important because it's going to show us where we are as a nation in a way which we really don't understand or we don't have a good handle on at this stage. On that note, we have hit our 30 minutes. Any final thoughts, John?
No, thanks. Great discussion as always, and look forward to the next one, where I think if everything works out, we'll have a guest join us as well.
That's right. It'll be our first Jay-Z show of the new year, and I look forward to it. I hope all of you who are in the audience here today or tuning in over the next few days will join us again next week. Thank you.
Great. Thanks.